So it's called the Worm Farmer's Handbook, and it has been very well received worldwide. It helps, and so it helps people to get into it on a larger scale. Whether you want your whole school to vermicompost the cafeteria waste, or you're in a business or a restaurant or institution and you want to vermicompost on a larger scale, or if you want that to be your income, if you want to do commercial vermicomposting, you can learn all of those things from this book. And the book is not a recipe where do this, do this, do this, because everybody has different approaches, different needs, differing amounts of money and resources. And so instead, I show how people around the world are doing vermicomposting. And, it's like, okay, this is in a developing country and they're using concrete blocks and it's working really well for them. And then you get into other countries that are using these continuous flow-through reactors that they're the most advanced technology. So you have that in Belgium, in Turkey, Mexico on a really large scale, and other parts of the world. So I've heard from people from every continent except for Antarctica. The annual Vermiculture conference is mid to large scale. So, especially for commercial operations, people who want to make money from vermicomposting, but there are all kinds of scales. Some are in somebody's basement or their garage, and they're making some income from selling the vermicompost and or the worms. And then you have really huge operations too, in farm scale, so you have somebody who might have some farm animals, and so they have manure, and so they feed it to worms. And then you have businesses. I've had people from paper mills come to learn about vermicomposting, because when they process the paper to recycle it, they end up with sludge. And, and it can't be, the fibers of the paper are so short, they can't be recycled again. They can't be made into something again. So you can feed it to worms, and the worms love it. So people with brewery waste, people from restaurants, anybody who generates some type of organic material comes to the worm conference to learn more about it. So the worms will they'll eat most things that are organic of origin, okay, that were once living or came from a living being. They love livestock manure, but not chicken manure. Chicken manure is too high in ammonia. It will kill the worms. So, but dairy manure, dairy cows, sheep, goats, horses, pigs, all sorts of farm animals. The worms just love their manure. But you can also feed them food waste. In different parts of the world, they're eating Humanure, so from humans. And then food processing waste, and like I said, brewery waste, and all sorts of things. But whether you want to do, if you think you might want to do commercial vermicomposting, or you have a farm and you have a lot of organic material to manage, I recommend that you always start with a small worm bin, a home kitchen type worm bin. It doesn't have to be in your kitchen. I've kept it in my bathroom. I've closet. People have made lovely furniture out of worm bins, coffee tables, other types of things. So, a worm bin can be anywhere, but you really need to start small. You can't just, read my book and say, oh, I'm gonna buy 100 pounds of earthworms, because that would be 100,000 of them, and I'm gonna do this large scale. Well, would you just, without knowing anything, would you just pick up a herd of cattle and decide that you're going to be a cattle farmer? No, you have to really study it. And, if that was my goal, to have a herd of cattle, I would probably start with one cow, just to learn the husbandry, animal husbandry, of raising that cow and helping it to be healthy. And it's the same with worms, because I'm shocked. People are like, they're just worms, whatever. And it's like, they're actually pretty expensive to buy. And so you don't want them to, there's many ways they could die from mismanagement. And so it's really important to just start with 1 pound and master vermicomposting before you decide to expand to a larger level. When you decide to expand to a larger bin, don't use paper, because then it's mushy, and it just won't serve you well on a larger scale. So my favorite kind of bedding in a larger system is finished compost, meaning that it has gone through that thermophilic heat stage, the heat has come down, and it's cured for several months, so that the likelihood of it heating up again is very unlikely. And also, in a larger system, using that compost, you would only put 6 inches deep. That's it. Don't go more than that, because whenever you have a lot of organic material, you're going to have just gazillions of microorganisms. And the microorganisms will feed on that organic material, and their activity creates heat. And so again, you don't want your vermicomposting system to heat up. And so that's why I recommend starting with 6 inches of bedding, in a larger system, and then only adding about 1 inch of food. So food, it's more active. It hasn't gone through a heating and cooling and curing stage. It has the ability to heat up, whether it be livestock manure or food waste or brewery waste or whatever. It could heat up. So you only want to apply about 1 inch deep. And then wait until the food is consumed before you add more. So it's not a daily thing. And you may even see references to, you may see a worm farmer say, yeah, I feed X amount of food waste or feedstock per day. They don't. They are not feeding daily. They're feeding every 2 or 3 days when the food is gone. And so if they give you a daily rate, they take a weekly rate and divide it by 7. Okay? So very important, because if you lay down that food waste and then you say on Monday and then Tuesday you say, okay, time to feed again, this is not all consumed, depending on your operation, the number of worms you have. And so you put new fresh feedstock on top, and then this just, the lower stuff doesn't get eaten, and it can just, cause problems in the worm bin. You want your worms to go up to eat, okay? And so that's why you put the feedstock on the top, so they'll come up for it. And when they're finished eating it, it will be smooth. So we call it the pool table effect, shooting pool. Because when you first add that feedstock, it'll be kind of lumpy. But then once the worms have finished eating it, it'll be flat like a pool table. So, and another way that you manage your worm bin is to keep obviously the worms need moisture to live, right? And so you use your bin in a way that most of the moisture is on top. The top, 4 to 6 inches if it's a larger system, okay? In a smaller worm bin, it's going to be, the top couple of inches. But you want to make so you're not saturating the whole bin. The worms will seek out moisture, and so if you add too much moisture to the bin, it'll collect on the bottom. The worms will go down there, and you want them up here to eat the food. So very important to do that, no matter what size system you have. Because the earthworm castings always end up on the bottom of a system, and so to get to the castings, you would have to dig, so it can be labor intensive. If you're talking about a large system, when you've got, a large horizontal bin, or you have the concrete blocks, you're going to be managing the bin so that the earthworms stay in the top 4 to 6 inches where it's moist and where the food is. And so when it comes time to harvest, you're going to use a pitchfork to remove that top 4 to 6 inches and put the worms into a, fresh bedding situation. And then you're going to have to shovel the castings out. And so, again, labor intensive. If you have a 200-foot long bin, then that's a lot of labor. And that's why these continuous flow-through reactors have been created. And so they're made out of metal. They're raised off the floor on legs. And they're raised, at least a couple of feet high, maybe 30 inches or so. And then the bottom, surprisingly, the bottom of that bin that's raised off the floor is a grate that's 2 inches by 4 inches each hole. So really big holes, and you look at it and you go, it looks like the material would just fall through, But what you do is you take like postal paper, that brown paper, you put that on the bottom to cover those holes, and then you put your 6 inches of moist bedding that the worms are going to feel comfortable in, right? And then you only feed an inch or, less than 2 inches at a time, and the castings will go to the bottom on top of that paper. And the bin is a couple of feet deep, and it takes a while for it to fill up because, you're only feeding an inch at a time. But in the meantime, the castings accumulate on the bottom and they knit together. And so they just kind of, form together. And in the meantime, that paper is disintegrating. And so then what you do is you use, we call it a breaker bar, that skims over that grate with those holes, and it gets pulled in one direction and then another to just skim about an inch off the bottom. And because there's so much weight in the bin and those castings are kind of knitted together, then it'll hold instead of the whole thing falling through. And so that's why it's really important to wait until the bin is full and stable before you start harvesting. But then you can start harvesting once a week. And depending on the size of the bin, you can get quite a bit of vermicompost. There are other options, such as trommels, so these are long tubes that move in a circle, and they have screens that will screen the smaller material will come through and the worms will come out the other end. So many ways to harvest. In the United States, vermicompost sells for a huge amount of money. That can be very profitable for the vermicomposter. And so let's take the example of thermophilic compost. So again, totally different. That's the compost bin that you have in your backyard or that you do on a really large scale. Say your city picks up all your green waste and takes it to a composting facility, where it goes through that heat cycle. Well, in the United States, if you try to sell a cubic yard of compost, finished compost, you'll get about up to $30 for a cubic yard. But if you sell a cubic yard of vermicompost from the worm bin, then it sells for $200 to $1,200 per cubic yard. So quite a bit of difference. And so it's very valuable. And that's why some people get into commercial vermicomposting. I give examples in my book. In the last chapter, I go into detail about different vermicomposting operations so people can just, read through it and say, wow, I think I'd like to try this and maybe something from over here and, combine it into something that works for them. But I end the book with, there's a worm farm in California in the United States where there's a very mild climate. So you can just do vermicomposting on the ground there. And this man became a millionaire. He makes over $4 million a year from selling vermicompost and compost. And so, so it can be a very lucrative situation. But lots of research studies have taken place to look at the effects of vermicompost on plant growth and also suppressing plant diseases and repelling insects. And so vermicompost always outperforms compost, regular compost. And that's a reason why it's so valuable. And you need very little. You need less vermicompost to add, to soil to get these just amazing results. So I have a picture in my book of a turnip study we did. And it was 3 different seasons outdoors. So spring, fall, spring. And we made sure that all of the plots had equal amounts of nitrogen. And you look at the picture of the turnips and you're like, there is no way that all of these turnips have equal amounts of nitrogen, but they do. So some turnips had no vermicompost added to the plots. And you can see it's just a regular sized turnip, okay? So, it's not very big, and it's just got one spindly root coming out of it. And then, just by mixing in 10% by volume vermicompost, the next picture you go, oh my gosh, it's huge. It's so much bigger than the one with no vermicompost. And the root system is just super well developed. And the turnip greens, which, farmers sell turnip greens. People love to buy them and eat them. And they're just so extensive. It's amazing. And then you look at 20% by volume and, it's even bigger. And we stopped there because according to literature, if we had done 40% by volume, it wouldn't be that much bigger than the 30%, and 50%, it becomes too much for the plant. And so it starts looking more like, it had 0 vermicompost. So that's the beauty of it, especially since it's so expensive. It's wonderful that such a little bit goes such a long way. So what's really wonderful about that experiment, again, we rely so much on NPK, we consider that's the most important thing. And nitrogen is particularly important for plant growth. And so what's interesting about by seeing that all three plots had equal amounts of nitrogen, it's like, it's not the nitrogen in the, NPK is not that big of a deal in vermicompost. You will not see NPK readings in vermicompost and go, wow, that's amazing, because it's not, So it is the microorganisms. And scientists are still trying to unlock, everything that's going on with vermicomposting, but between the plethora of microbe species and numbers, and there are fulvic acids and humic acids and plant growth hormones. There's just all kinds of things that happen inside the worm and come out the other end. And you'll see that not all vermicompost is alike. And it's really important to understand this, because if you're if you're feeding the worms dairy manure, then what they excrete, their poop, will have different qualities than if you feed the worms food waste or goat manure or sheep manure or whatever. So it really depends on the feedstock, the way in which the vermicompost is created, the different methods. And then it affects plants differently too. So it's very interesting that plants will have more favorable responses to different types of vermicompost. So in other words, if you have like a dairy manure vermicompost, and you do experiments with tomatoes, peppers, petunias, a variety of plants, you'll see that some have a greater response to that dairy manure than others. And then if you use, like maybe you've taken that paper sludge and fed it to the worms. And so again, it's going to be a different type of vermicompost. And you might find that certain plants prefer that. So it's not like synthetic fertilizer where, okay, here we go, folks. It really varies on the effectiveness and the plant response and the different feedstocks. So now really the best thing you can do is to pre-compost the feedstock that you're going to feed the worms. All right? Pre-composting, that means that you will thermophilically compost whatever that feedstock is, whether it's dairy manure or food waste or whatever. You'll get it to the high temperatures that will kill pathogens such as E. coli and salmonella, and also kill seeds, okay? If there could be seeds in the manure, there's definitely seeds in food waste. And so those will not be killed in the worm bed. And so you destroy them through the pre-composting process. What makes it pre-composting instead of composting is that it goes through that heat cycle for about a month, 4 to 6 weeks. And then the temperatures start to drop down. And with regular thermophilic composting, like I mentioned earlier, you let those temperatures go down, but then it has to cure for several months so you don't get these temperature spikes. And people complain, oh, I bought compost and it burned my plants, and it's because they didn't go through that curing process. So cured, like I said, cured mature compost is great as a bedding for the worms, only 6 inches deep, because again, you don't want it to heat up. And that's why we're using it as bedding, but not feedstock. We want feedstock that just has more oomph to it, you know? And so in that pre-composting, we've gone through the heating, we've killed the pathogens in the seeds, it started to drop in temperature. That's when we remove it and let it cool off, and we feed only 1 inch to the earthworms. And so not only have you killed those undesirable things, but you've reduced the volume, which is really important because, again, vermicomposting is a horizontal process, and so you need a lot of space. But also, it has turned whatever the feedstock is into a homogeneous product, because we know what compost looks like. Compost looks like soil, and the particles look the same. And so you won't get this picky eater thing. The worms can just very easily take in those tiny particles and they won't show a preference. Whereas if you had fed them like raw food waste, you'll find that some types of food waste disappears more quickly than other types of food waste. So through the pre-compost, you don't have to deal with that. It all looks alike to the worms. But in the 30 years that I've been teaching vermicompost, I have seen an increase. And so, more people are doing it. And, well over 1,000 people have come to my worm farming conferences, So again, these people are mostly in it to produce commercial vermicompost and make a living from it. So, and then, just the number of countries that I've heard from, I see it taking place all over the world. I mentioned in my book, I have a picture of one worm farm in Cuba, but there were 174 worm farms on that island. And it's because, the United States and Cuba had a problem with communism, and so there was an embargo. And all of a sudden, the food and other resources that usually came into the island were no longer able to come. And so people got very creative. And so they were really able to to farm and raise food. But vermicomposting played a really big part in improving the soils and increasing production and decreasing the plant diseases and pest attacks. So people are finding that worldwide. And another really great development I found is, a lot of women are marginalized in many countries, and they don't have access to financial stability. And so there's a growing trend of women reaching financial stability through vermicomposting. So it's really wonderful to see. A lot of it is taking place in India, in Guatemala, in many other countries like that, where women are given some worms, and in India there's sacred cows, and their dung is everywhere, and so they're able to use the cow dung and some food waste, and and the worms create this wonderful, valuable product, and then the women are able to be financially secure. So it's really being handled all over the place. But it's just important to do it correctly, There are many. So just having a basic understanding of earthworms and the type of earthworm that you use, the species, not mixing a bunch of species, and then doing it in a way where you're not going to overheat And so just basic things to understand. And so that's what I covered in my book. I really got into all aspects of, how to choose the right system and how to how to set up the system, how to feed effectively, safely. And I talk about regulations. I talk about, the different harvesting methods, and then testing the vermicompost for to make sure that it's good quality, and I give parameters for different things that are tested, like NPK and other macro and micronutrients, but also salts, like regular thermophilic compost, depending on the feedstock, you can have a lot of salt in your compost, and then certain plant species are very sensitive to it. And so, so that's something you want to check for in your vermicompost as well. So, I'm Rhonda Sherman, and I've been at North Carolina State University for just short of 30 years. And I was hired because recycling had just been mandated in the state, and everyone was saying, what do we do? How do we recycle? And so I was hired to educate people and answer questions. And so I'm not only talking households, but businesses and then the trash managers. So landfill managers, government officials, everybody was wondering what's happening with recycling. And so I was hired for that. And, of course, it's expected to publish. And so I right away wrote several publications about recycling, but I also decided to write something about vermicomposting. So I titled it "Worms Can Recycle Your Garbage." And it flew off the shelves. It had to keep being reprinted because there was just such a clamor to learn more about vermicomposting. And it just spread beyond, I served the people of North Carolina, but I started hearing from people in other states and then other countries. And now I've heard from people in 121 countries. They have contacted me specifically about vermicomposting to learn more. And so it changed the course of my career. And because I spent most of my time answering questions about vermicomposting. And there was already books and information about small-scale vermicomposting, but not mid to large-scale vermicomposting. So I really focused on that. And that's where, the people in 121 countries, they're not saying, oh, what do I do with my little kitchen worm bin? They're saying, I want to get into it, as to become financially independent through vermicomposting.